After you have edited any of those pages, that begins to outside of the default content regions, that introduces this concept that I want to talk about. It's called ghosted. Pages are either ghosted or unghosted, which is just Microsoft's way of saying they are either read from the file system or completely in database. We want to avoid unghosting pages, and here's why. The general rendering, and I'm going to simplify this severely, is that when an HTTP request comes in from a user, the user says, okay, hey, I want to go and get my web page. The first thing that the server does is it checks its in-memory cache to say, hey, do I have a cached version of this? If it does have a cached version, it then just goes ahead and sends it right back to the user. If it doesn't have a cached version of this, then it has to go all the way back and render the page. To render this page, it assembles it in 3 stages. The first stage is pulling it off the file system. By pulling it off the file system, it looks for the master page and grabs it from there. Then it will go and say, all right, now I need to get my content out of the database. Or if it's an ASP page, off the file system, if it's ghosted, which is faster. And then what it does is it creates and caches out this third type of page. And this third type of page is basically contains the master page with the static content placed in it. This is what IIS then caches so that it doesn't have to go through the process of looking at the file system. And then the final step is to insert into that cached page content from the database. Once these two are going back and forth, it's fairly quick then to also save out another version of this in cache, which gets updated more frequently, so isn't as important. But this initial process of combining the pages down is much faster to execute off of the file system than it is off of the database. So that being said, if we look at this a different way, we take our pages and we can say that, okay, if we have all these file system pages, the ASPX pages, and a single master page, we can just render them down all like that and go. But as soon as we break that connection, we then have to introduce another concept of another page that it has to pull out of the database and then load it to the file system. So this increases the number of different page combinations that the system has to be worried about to figure out how to load it, not to mention the database time. So to simplify, if a page comes from the file system and is attached to a master page, do not unghost it. Additional problems that you will run into if you unghost a page is that if you change the master page, those changes will no longer be reflected in the unghosted database-driven page. That means that consistency will break. So rule of thumb, don't unghost the page. And this is all the stuff that you can do with SharePoint Designer. And you can do a lot more even as far as other... You can do a whole bunch of other things. You can do simple workflows. You can do basic customizations. And you can also use this thing called a data view web part. And the data view web part is definitely something worth exploring on your own, because that is That is a very important thing that you can do to create a lot of custom pages without a whole lot of work and create new views into the different lists. Now, moving on from this, we're going to be diving into the actual what would be considered SharePoint development. To this point, we have done nothing that a power user isn't capable of doing. SharePoint Designer has a graphical user interface. The web interface is pretty easy. So all of the stuff that you have seen now, especially with practice, can be accomplished by a standard power user. Now we're going to start diving into the more development aspect of SharePoint, which will require cracking out Visual Studio and really starting getting down into the nitty-gritty of what it can do.